It all began when Daniel made the disastrous decision to sleep with his brother's wife, Emily. It was as if the entire foundation of our family had been ripped apart in an instant. Brian and Emily had been together for years. They were everything that Daniel wasn't. A stable, committed couple who had built their life on love, trust, and mutual respect. But Daniel, in his reckless pursuit of what he called true love, betrayed both his brother and his own marriage in one fell swoop. He convinced himself that his feelings for Emily were genuine, that their connection was something he couldn't ignore. But I couldn't help but feel like he was just looking for an excuse to act on his impulses. When the affair came to light, it tore through our family like a hurricane. Brian was devastated. His entire world, his wife, and his brother were all gone in one move. Emily left him shortly after the affair came to light, claiming that Daniel was her true love and that she had no choice but to be with him. For a brief time, it seemed as if everything would be okay. Daniel had his new relationship, and he genuinely believed he'd done the right thing. He kept telling us that true love can't be ignored. But his world came crashing down just as quickly as it had built up. Within 2 months of being with Emily, she left him for another man. Someone who could give her everything Daniel couldn't. She not only took Daniel's heart, but she also took everything else. She drained his savings, took all his money, and left him emotionally and financially ruined. Now, Daniel is back in our lives, demanding redemption. He says that he's learned his lesson, that he made a mistake, and that he needs a second chance to rebuild his life. He wants us, along with Brian and Emily, to forgive him and help him get back on his feet. But the problem is, he hasn't really shown any real remorse. He's still blaming Emily for everything that happened, claiming that she manipulated him and that he was simply following his heart. It's as if he doesn't understand the depth of his betrayal, not just to Brian and Emily, but to the entire family. And now he expects us to sweep it all under the rug and help him start over as if nothing ever happened. My emotions are conflicted. I love my son, but I also believe that he needs to take full responsibility for the damage he has caused. He destroyed 2 marriages, his own and his brother's, and the consequences of his actions have reverberated through every part of our family. It's been months since the betrayal came to light, and yet I still don't know how to feel about his sudden request for forgiveness. I want to believe that people can change, but I also know that the damage he's caused is not something that can be easily undone. Brian, understandably, is still angry. He doesn't want anything to do with Daniel at the moment, and I can't blame him. After everything that happened, he feels betrayed not only by his wife but by his own brother. Emily, on the other hand, hasn't reached out to either of us. I don't know what she's thinking or what she feels, but I'm sure the pain she's going through is unimaginable. She trusted Daniel, and he destroyed that trust. I'm afraid that no matter what we do, we'll never be able to heal these wounds. So here I am, torn between wanting to support my son and wanting to protect the family that's been shattered by his actions. I'm not sure what the right thing to do is, and I'm not sure if I'll ever be able to forgive him for what he's done. My heart aches for Brian, for Emily, and for the family that we used to be. But I also know that I need to make peace with this situation, for my own sake and for the sake of the family that still exists. I guess I'm just asking for some perspective. Was I wrong for wanting to shut Daniel out after everything he's done? Or is it okay to feel like he needs to face the consequences of his actions before we let him back in? How do you move forward when betrayal cuts this deep? 2 years ago, Daniel met Sharon, a woman who, on the surface, seemed like everything he needed. Sharon was calm, thoughtful, and patient, the kind of person who naturally balanced out Daniel's impulsive and often unpredictable nature. For a while, it actually looked like she had brought some stability into his life. They married just over a year ago in a small, intimate ceremony. Sharon was wonderful, and it was clear she genuinely loved Daniel. We all hoped that settling down would help him take life more seriously. But that hope didn't last long. Before long, Daniel's restlessness crept back in. He started spending more time away from home, offering vague explanations about needing space or time to think. We saw how hard Sharon was trying. She stayed supportive, kept showing up, kept trying to make the marriage work, but the cracks were obvious. What we didn't realize at the time was just how deep those cracks really were. Then, 2 months ago, everything fell apart. Brian, our brother, came to us heartbroken. He had just uncovered the devastating truth that his wife, Emily, was cheating on him. He didn't know who with, not at first, but something in her had changed. She had grown distant, evasive, and secretive. Her sudden late nights, unexplained getaways, and coldness toward Brian all pointed to something being terribly wrong. When he eventually got access to her phone, the vague but telling messages he found confirmed what he had feared. She was having an affair. Around that same time, Sharon was nearing her breaking point. Daniel's constant absence, his emotional withdrawal, and his reluctance to be honest had taken a toll on her. Then came the night that changed everything. After yet another disappearance, Sharon finally confronted him. She asked him directly if there was someone else. At first, Daniel deflected, blaming stress and work pressure, but Sharon didn't let it go. She pushed, and eventually he cracked. What he confessed shocked her to her core. Daniel admitted he had been cheating. When Sharon asked who it was, the truth hit like a wrecking ball. He had been having an affair with Emily. Yes, that Emily, Brian's wife. Sharon was shattered. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was who he had betrayed her with. Someone close. Someone within our family circle. The pain and humiliation were unimaginable. Once we put the pieces together, it all made sense. Brian's broken trust, Sharon's confrontation, Daniel's confession. It all pointed to one horrifying reality. Daniel and Emily had been seeing each other behind everyone's backs, while their spouses were left in the dark. And just like that, everything fell apart. What stunned us the most wasn't just the affair. It was their complete lack of remorse. When everything came to light and they were confronted, neither Emily nor Daniel showed any real understanding of the pain they had caused. There was no apology, no trace of guilt. Instead, they tried to rationalize their choices. Daniel spoke about how he and Emily had formed an unbreakable bond, something he called a once-in-a-lifetime connection that couldn't be denied. He even used the term true love, as if that somehow absolved them of the lies and destruction they'd left in their wake. Emily wasn't any better. She insisted her marriage to Brian had been falling apart long before anything happened with Daniel. According to her, Daniel was simply someone who saw her in a way Brian never had. It was maddening. They both seemed convinced that the strength of their feelings justified the betrayal, as if falling in love gave them a free pass to wreck not just one, but 2 marriages. They were so caught up in their fantasy that they couldn't, or wouldn't, see the damage they had done. This wasn't just infidelity. It was a devastating betrayal of family. Daniel didn't just cheat on his wife. He crossed a line that destroyed his own brother's life. Sharon, Daniel's wife, was completely blindsided. She had no idea he had been unfaithful. Her heartbreak was palpable. She had stood by him for years, trusted him, believed in their marriage. And now, everything she knew had been ripped away. And Brian? The betrayal hit him like a wrecking ball. Learning that his wife had been unfaithful was painful enough, but realizing that the other man was his own brother? That broke him. He ended things with Emily immediately and cut all contact with Daniel. There was no repairing that kind of breach. The devastation was absolute. My wife and I were at a loss. We couldn't comprehend what Daniel had done, and the fallout left our entire family in pieces. Brian moved out, leaving the home he had shared with Emily, and we've barely seen him since. He's been trying to pick up the pieces, trying to heal, but it's been an uphill battle. The damage is done. And honestly, it's hard to imagine how anything will ever go back to the way it was. As the days passed, the weight of the situation became heavier. My wife and I, who had spent years raising our sons with values of loyalty, trust, and respect, now had to face the heartbreaking truth that one of them had destroyed those very principles. We couldn't help but wonder what we had missed. What went wrong? What had we failed to see or understand? These questions tormented us, but the more we asked, the less we seemed to have answers for. Meanwhile, Daniel's life seemed to be moving forward, at least on the surface. He and Emily were openly flaunting their relationship, posting photos and sharing status updates about their new beginning. Felt like a slap in the face every time we saw it. How could they be so shameless, so oblivious to the devastation they had caused. Emily, who had once been a part of our family, was now proudly standing by Daniel's side, as if nothing had happened. She acted as if their love was something to be celebrated, not realizing, or perhaps not caring, that the people they had hurt the most were still suffering in silence. The consequences of their actions were glaringly evident. Brian had moved out of the home he shared with Emily, taking their children with him. He couldn't stand to be in the same space with her, let alone face Daniel after everything that had happened. Sharon, Daniel's ex-wife, left him too, retreating to her parents' house to try to make sense of the wreckage Daniel had caused in her life. It wasn't just their marriages that had crumbled. It was the foundation of the entire family. The unity we had once enjoyed, the close-knit relationships we had built over years of shared memories, was shattered, and it seemed like nothing could bring it back together. As the weeks dragged on, the emotional distance between everyone grew wider. Brian, understandably, wanted nothing to do with Daniel. The betrayal was too much for him to handle. My wife and I tried reaching out to Brian to offer him our support, but he kept us at arm's length. He was hurt, angry, and justifiably so. Sharon, too, made it clear that she wanted nothing to do with Daniel. She refused to respond to his calls or texts, leaving him isolated and feeling the full weight of the destruction he had caused. And yet, despite all the damage, Daniel seemed to think that time would heal everything. He thought that the world would eventually move on and that people would accept his relationship with Emily. But he couldn't have been more wrong. The damage he had done was far too deep for that. The betrayal had ruptured not only his marriage to Sharon but also the bond between him and his brother. It was a wound that would never fully heal. For my wife and me, the days were filled with confusion, anger, and sadness. We had spent so much time nurturing our family, only to watch it all unravel because of one person's selfishness. We had hoped that, eventually, the family would come back together, that we would find a way to heal, but it felt like a distant dream. As much as we wanted to be there for Daniel, we couldn't overlook the pain he had caused. How could we support him when he hadn't taken responsibility for the pain he had inflicted on everyone around him? I think what hurt the most was the realization that Daniel hadn't fully grasped the gravity of his actions. He seemed to believe that his relationship with Emily would eventually be accepted, that people would forgive and forget. But the reality was that there was no easy way out of this mess. The damage was irreversible, and it wasn't just about fixing marriages. It was about restoring trust, which was something that couldn't be mended overnight. For my wife and me, it felt like a never-ending cycle of disappointment and heartache. We were caught between our love for our son and the anger we felt towards him for destroying the family we had worked so hard to build. I didn't know how to fix this, or if it was even possible to fix. All I knew was that, for now, I had to focus on being there for Brian and Sharon, to help them heal because they were the ones who had truly been hurt. As for Daniel, I couldn't say whether he would ever realize the depth of his mistakes or whether he would find his way back to the family he had so carelessly torn apart. All I could do was hope that, one day, he would come to understand what he had done and take responsibility for the fallout that was still so fresh and raw. Every time we tried to speak with Daniel about the damage he'd caused, he shrugged it off like it wasn't a big deal. In his mind, being in love somehow justified everything, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the fallout. He couldn't, or wouldn't, see the pain he had inflicted on Brian and Sharon. He was completely blinded by his feelings for Emily. But karma has a way of circling back. Barely 2 months into their relationship, the tables turned. Emily left Daniel. Just like that, she told him she'd met someone else, her true soulmate, and she walked away without a second thought. But she didn't leave empty-handed. She took everything, his savings, his valuables, anything she could get her hands on. Daniel was left with absolutely nothing. Suddenly, the man who had once claimed love was all that mattered was standing at our doorstep, broke, humiliated, and heartbroken. He said he'd been manipulated, used, and discarded, that Emily had only ever seen him as a stepping stone. He was a mess, and now he wasn't just looking to us for comfort, he was asking for forgiveness. He wanted Brian to forgive him, to give him a second chance at being a brother. He wanted Sharon to understand his mistake, He wanted us to wipe the slate clean, as if everything he had done could be erased now that he was the one suffering. But how are we supposed to do that? My wife and I are torn. On one hand, he's our son, we love him. We don't want to see him like this. But on the other hand, he blew up 2 marriages. He shattered his brother. He crushed Sharon. And the worst part? He still doesn't fully grasp the magnitude of what he did. He says he's learned his lesson, but his version of remorse still sounds like victimhood. Like he's the one who needs comforting, not the people he hurt. Brian is still healing. It's taken him so much strength just to find some stability again. Sharon has been trying to piece her life back together too. And now Daniel wants us to bring all of that pain right back into the room, just because he needs a place to land? My wife believes we should be there for him, help him rebuild. I understand where she's coming from. He's still our child. But I can't shake this feeling that trying to help him right now, without real accountability or remorse on his part, would just mean betraying Brian and Sharon all over again. So, Reddit, am I the asshole for not wanting to give my son another chance? For feeling like he doesn't deserve a clean slate after all the hurt he caused? Or am I being too hard, too unwilling to forgive? I honestly don't know anymore. It's been 3 days since I shared my story, and I'm honestly blown away by the support and advice I've received. I've read every comment, some more than once, and I want to say thank you to everyone who reached out. Your words gave me the clarity and courage I needed to take the next step. After sitting with everything for a while, I realized I needed to speak directly with Brian. Before making any final decisions about Daniel, I had to understand how Brian truly felt. He deserved that consideration more than anyone. We met up yesterday, and it was one of the hardest conversations I've had in a long time. Brian didn't hold back. He made it clear that he wants nothing to do with Daniel. There was no hesitation in his voice, only raw honesty. He said that while he's doing his best to move forward, the wound is still fresh, and every day feels like a battle. The betrayal wasn't just about the affair. It was about losing his brother, someone he had protected, guided, and trusted his entire life. Brian told me how difficult it's been to wake up each morning and face the world with this huge piece of his life missing. The pain isn't just emotional, it's physical. He's haunted by images he never asked to see, memories now tainted by deceit. And Daniel's presence only makes it worse. Every reminder reopens the hurt, making healing nearly impossible. He also shared something that cut me to my core. He spoke about how drained he's been trying to keep it all together. Not just for himself, but for the kids. I saw it in his eyes. He looked completely spent, like the weight of everything was crushing him from the inside out. It was the look of a father doing everything he could to stay strong, but clearly burning out in the process. That's when I offered to step in. I told him that if he was okay with it, I'd take the grandkids for a while, just to give him a break, a chance to breathe, maybe even rest without the chaos weighing him down. He didn't say much, but the relief in his face said everything. He needs time. He needs space. And most of all, he needs to focus on healing, without the shadow of betrayal looming over him. For now, I'm doing what I can. I'm respecting Brian's boundaries. I'm supporting him the way any parent would. And whatever happens next with Daniel, it will be on Brian's terms, not anyone else's. Thank you again to everyone who encouraged me to reach out to Brian and put his needs first. I don't have all the answers yet, but I do know I'm doing the right thing for him and for our family. Brian's words were heavy with both pain and clarity. It was clear that, while his children were the one thing holding him together, there was still a long road ahead for him in terms of healing. His kids were his anchor, the only thing that kept him grounded. The thought of being without them, even briefly, was more than he could bear. Their presence, their routines, and the simple yet profound demands of everyday life were what kept him from spiraling. But I couldn't help but wonder if the weight of everything else, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the loss, was too much for even his kids to bear alone. They gave him purpose, but could they keep him from sinking into the depths of despair? It was a bittersweet understanding. Brian, despite being an incredibly strong father, was clearly struggling to find his own footing in the aftermath of everything that had happened. And while his kids were an undeniable source of strength, I worried about his emotional well-being. Was he leaning too heavily on them? Could he sustain himself without them? Then Brian revealed that Emily had reached out to him several times, trying to make amends, but he was firm in his decision. He wanted nothing to do with her, no matter how many times she apologized or tried to justify her actions. She had sent messages, first begging for his forgiveness, and later attempting to spin a narrative that she and Daniel were meant to be, that their bond was something special, as though it excused everything. But the irony wasn't lost on me. Emily's new relationship had fallen apart too. Her so-called true love turned out to be just as fleeting and false as her marriage to Brian. Yet, she still tried to manipulate him, attempting to rewrite the past and drag him back into her twisted reality. But Brian was done. He had made it clear to her that there was nothing left to salvage, blocking her on all platforms to prevent any further contact. Hearing all of this from Brian only solidified my thoughts about Daniel. There was no way he could re-enter Brian's life right now. It was clear that the wounds were still raw, and reopening them would only make everything worse. Brian needed time, space, and a chance to rebuild his life. He didn't need the weight of Daniel's actions dragging him further down. Daniel needed to face the consequences of what he had done, and expecting Brian or anyone else to simply forgive and forget was unrealistic. Brian's own journey toward healing was slow but steady. He had started therapy, where he was learning how to set boundaries and prioritize his mental health. He had taken up hiking and painting, using these activities to help calm his mind and find a sense of peace. He even mentioned the possibility of relocating, trying to start fresh in a new city, away from the memories that still haunted him. As hard as it was for him, it was clear he was making strides toward healing, and that was something Daniel couldn't take away from him. In the end, the more I thought about it, the more I realized that Brian was doing the right thing for himself. His focus now was on his own recovery, on taking care of himself and finding ways to heal. He had been through enough, and the last thing he needed was Daniel trying to push his way back into his life, to justify his actions, and make everything seem like it was okay again. It wasn't. The damage had been done, and it was time for Daniel to learn that actions have consequences. I had to support Brian in his decision to distance himself from Daniel, knowing it was the only way for him to truly heal and move forward. After talking with Brian, I found myself even more conflicted. Every part of me, as a father, wants to protect and support my children. But how do you do that when one of them is the source of so much pain? I knew I had to speak with my wife and figure out where we really stood on this mess. She's always leaned more sympathetic toward Daniel. He's our son, after all, and I think a part of her still sees the little boy she raised, not the man who blew up 2 marriages and shattered his brother. She's been clinging to the hope that if we just support him through this low point, maybe he'll come out of it better, more grounded. But when I told her what Brian had said, how deep the wounds still were, how much it had gutted him to lose both his wife and his brother, something shifted in her. She went quiet, and then I saw it hit her. She hadn't fully realized how badly Brian was still hurting. I think she believed that with time, maybe this would all just settle down. But hearing how raw it still was for Brian made her see that maybe reconciliation isn't something we can, or should, force. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said she felt like she was losing both of them. One son to anger, resentment, and heartbreak. The other to selfishness and reckless choices. That broke me. For all our love as parents, there's no manual for this. No rulebook for what to do when the damage is this deep. We came to a decision together. Daniel needs to take ownership of this. We can't fix it for him. We can't keep cushioning him from the consequences of his own behavior. My wife, who's always tried to keep the peace, admitted that maybe her attempts to bridge the gap between the 2 brothers were only making things worse. So she's stepping back, we're stepping back. We told Daniel we love him. That hasn't changed. But he's on his own now in this. He needs to take a hard look at what he's done and decide if he's going to do the work to earn back the trust he shattered. That's not something we can do for him. This whole situation has been unbelievably difficult. But reading through the comments on my original post, hearing all the perspectives, the hard truths, and the empathy has helped us more than I can explain. It's given us the clarity and strength we needed to face this head-on. The road ahead won't be easy, but we're committed to doing what's right. For Brian, for Sharon, and even for Daniel. Thank you to everyone who took the time to respond. Your words made a difference. Truly. Hi everyone. I know quite a few of you were waiting for an update, so here it is. Just a couple of days after my talk with Brian, Daniel showed up at our doorstep again. But this time, he wasn't just seeking forgiveness. He was desperate. He looked rough, unkempt, drained, nothing like the man he used to be. It was clear the situation had taken its toll. At first, he just stood there in silence, and for a moment, I didn't know what to expect. Eventually, he came clean. Emily had emptied his bank accounts and run off with another man. She took everything, left him penniless, and he couldn't even cover his rent. With nowhere else to go, he turned to us, hoping we'd take him in. I won't lie, my gut reaction was to say no. After all the damage he caused, welcoming him back into our home felt wrong. But my wife, in all her kindness, couldn't bear to turn him away. She doesn't condone what he did, none of us do. But seeing him in such a broken state stirred something in her. That maternal instinct kicked in, and she couldn't leave him out in the cold. We debated it for a while, and I finally agreed, but with firm conditions. We told him this stay would be temporary, and only if he showed true effort to make amends. He needed to apologize, not just to Brian, but especially to Sharon. From what we'd heard through her family, she's been struggling. The betrayal wrecked her. Sharon is one of the kindest people we've known, and she didn't deserve what happened. Daniel agreed. He promised he'd reach out to both Brian and Sharon, that he'd take accountability and begin to make things right. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel hopeful. Maybe, just maybe, he had finally realized the weight of what he'd done. But unfortunately, that hope didn't last long. Over the next 2 days, it became painfully clear that Daniel hadn't changed at all. Instead of taking any real responsibility for his actions or making any attempt to repair the damage he had done, he continued to behave carelessly. He spent his time lounging on the couch, watching TV, and scrolling aimlessly through his phone, acting as if nothing had happened. There was no sign of remorse, no sense of urgency to address the mess he had created. It was as if the gravity of his situation hadn't even registered with him. Rather than being devastated by the fact that Emily, the woman he had believed was his soulmate, had betrayed him and left him penniless, he seemed almost indifferent. It was as if he was waiting for the next opportunity to come along without any recognition of the consequences of his previous actions. My wife and I exchanged glances of growing frustration as Daniel wasted the precious time we had offered him. He made no effort to contact Brian or Sharon, no attempt to apologize or make things right. He wasn't trying to fix what he had broken. It was becoming glaringly obvious that we had made a mistake by letting him stay with us. Daniel wasn't interested in making amends. He was just looking for a place to crash while he figured out what to do next. Like the consequences of his betrayal weren't his problem to solve. I couldn't take it anymore. The anger and frustration boiled over, and I confronted him. I told him that we had expected more from him, that we had taken him in with the understanding that he would take responsibility for his actions. But instead, he was treating our home like a free hotel, contributing nothing, and showing no signs of remorse. My wife, who had initially been more sympathetic, was also starting to lose her patience. She told him, in no uncertain terms, that it was clear he wasn't ready to face the consequences of his behavior, and that he didn't deserve to stay with us if he wasn't going to take this situation seriously. We didn't hesitate for a moment longer. We told him that he had to pack his bags and leave within the hour. We made it crystal clear that he wouldn't be welcome back until he took genuine steps to apologize to Brian and Sharon and, more importantly, made real efforts to show that he was actively trying to fix the mess he had caused. Daniel looked stunned, as if he hadn't expected us to take such a firm stance. But that was the reality. We had reached our limit. We could no longer enable his reckless, irresponsible behavior. It was time for him to face the consequences of his actions, whether he was ready for it or not. After Daniel walked out, it didn't take long for the floodgates to open. Within hours, our phones lit up with texts, voicemails, and calls, each one more desperate than the last. He kept repeating the same lines over and over again. That he was sorry, that he understood now, that he wanted one more chance to prove himself. But we'd seen this movie before too many times. The same cycle, the same broken promises. We knew better than to believe that an apology meant change. So we told him plainly, we're not the ones you need to apologize to. It's not our forgiveness that matters. It's Brian's and Sharon's. They're the ones who trusted him, who let him into their lives and got burned in the most personal way possible. And until he can face them, own up to what he's done and truly try to make amends. His words are just that, words. Empty and overdue. At this point, my wife and I are done coddling Daniel. We're done brushing off his reckless behavior as just his way. He's not a kid anymore. He needs to understand that actions have weight, that his choices carry real consequences, and that the people he hurt don't owe him a clean slate just because he finally feels bad about it. Instead, we've turned our focus toward the ones who do deserve our energy. Brian and Sharon. They're the ones who need our support, and we're doing our best to be there for them as they try to rebuild their lives. It's not an easy process, far from it, but we're committed to showing up, day by day, in the quiet, steady ways that matter. A lot has happened since I last posted, and I wanted to give you all an update. This past week, my wife and I finally decided to step in a little more. We could see Brian was running on fumes, trying to be everything at once. A present father, an emotionally stable adult, and someone who's still grappling with heartbreak. It was too much, so we went over to his place and gently insisted. Let us take the kids for a bit. Just a week or two. Let him breathe. At first, he pushed back. He didn't want to be away from them, not even for a short while. That's just who Brian is. But we reminded him that it wasn't about giving up. It was about giving himself a chance to process everything. To take a step back and focus on his own healing, without the noise and demands of everyday parenting. Sometimes, love looks like sacrifice. And sometimes, it looks like knowing when to step away, even just for a moment. We're hoping this time gives Brian the space he needs. We're hoping it brings a little more peace into all of our lives. And most of all, we're hoping that Daniel finally realizes that redemption doesn't come with an apology. It comes with change.